Before we dive in, drop a quick hi in the comments. It may seem small, but trust me, it really helps YouTube share this story with more sci-fi fans like us. I'd love to see who's watching.
The soil in the demonstration tray was dead. Alejandro Buenavista had chosen it that way. Cracked gray dirt from a world nobody wanted, hauled across 6 jump gates so that strangers could watch it drink. 30 seconds, he told the small crowd, and thumbed the control. Inside the sealed glass chamber, the air changed. A haze gathered near the top, thickened, darkened. Then it rained. Real rain, fat and steady, drumming the glass and pooling in the dead soil until the gray went black with water. Someone in the crowd made a soft sound. A child pressed both hands to the glass. That was the part Alejandro loved, not the applause, the hands on the glass. The Galactic Innovation Exposition filled a hall the size of a city, and his booth was one of 10,000. Around him, the aisles roared with better-funded wonders, engines that folded space in miniature, medical swarms that rebuilt a severed limb while you watched, a weapons consortium 3 rows over demonstrating something that turned a steel block to vapor. He had a folding table, a glass box, and a tray of dead dirt. He had expected to stand here for 3 days and go home unnoticed. He had been wrong for 2 hours now, and the crowd kept coming. It doesn't seed the clouds, he was explaining to a cluster of university researchers. There are no clouds to seed on a dead world. It builds the humidity from whatever water is locked in the ground, the rock, the air, traps it, cycles it, and lets it fall. Give it a decade, and a dry world grows its own weather. Give it a century, and it doesn't need the machine anymore. And the power draw? One asked. Less than a pump station. That's the point. Anyone can flood a field once. This teaches a planet to do it forever. They asked good questions, wrote things down, moved on. He drank lukewarm water and reset the tray. He was refilling the reservoir when the noise of the aisle changed. Not louder, quieter. A hush moving toward him like a draft under a door. The crowd parted, and Lord Arthuros arrived at his booth. Alejandro knew who he was the way everyone at the fair knew, the way you know a mountain on the horizon. The Interstellar Development Consortium did not send buyers. It sent him, and it sent him rarely, and the booths he stopped at became famous by the end of the week. He was tall and built along human lines, lean and upright inside long, pale robes that fell without a wrinkle. From 10 feet away, he might have been a man. He was not a man. His face resolved as he came closer, and something in Alejandro's chest stepped back from it. The eyes were set a fraction too wide and did not blink together. And when he spoke, his mouth moved in a way that never quite matched the shapes of the words, as if the voice arrived from somewhere just behind the face. The voice itself was low. It never rose the entire time he stood there, and Alejandro found himself leaning in to catch it, which he supposed was the point. Dr. Buenavista. Arthuros looked at the glass chamber, where the last of the rain still beaded and ran. May I trouble you to run it again? I came the length of the hall on a rumor, and I would rather see than be told. Alejandro ran it again. The haze, the darkening, the rain. Arthuros watched without expression, or with one Alejandro couldn't read, and when the soil went black, he inclined his head, slow, almost reverent. Water, he said. Every young species dreams of gold, and the old ones learn it was always water. He turned those wide eyes on Alejandro. How many worlds have you shown this to? You're the first buyer who stopped. Then the others are fools, and I have a habit of profiting from other people's foolishness. A sound that might have been a laugh, air moving without force. Forgive me. The device is elegant, and I have a weakness for elegance. What I collect is context. Tell me about your people, Doctor. My people? Humanity. Arthuros folded his long hands. You are young out here. How far do you reach? A dozen colonies? More? Governed from one seat or many? A people who agree with themselves or argue? Alejandro answered easily, because it was flattering to be asked, because the man had crossed a city-sized hall to hear him, because there is nothing so pleasant as an important person interested in where you come from. 30-some colonies, he said, spreading fast, maybe too fast, governed loosely, a council, a lot of arguing, worlds that ran themselves between votes, frontier stock, independent to a fault. To a fault, Arthuros repeated, as if tasting it. And your frontier worlds, the newest, the driest, those would want your reign most of all. Those are exactly the ones that need it. Of course they are. Arthuros unfolded his hands. I'll have it. The prototype, the schematics, the manufacturing rights for the outer systems. Name a figure that frightens you, and I will meet it, because I would rather overpay a man of conscience than bargain with one. The figure Alejandro named frightened him. Arthuros met it without a flicker, pressed a long, cool hand to Alejandro's, and had a contract drawn before the rain had finished draining from the tray. It was only later, walking out of the signing room with his life rearranged and his hands not quite steady, that Alejandro turned one thing over and set it down again. Funny, he thought. He barely asked how it works. Then he laughed at himself, because a man who has just been made wealthy does not interrogate his good luck, and the thought slid off him the way water slid off that clean glass. The signing room led out onto a mezzanine above the hall, and the walk back to his booth took him past 3 other tables, where 3 other inventors stood grinning, the way he must have been grinning, shaking hands with sober consortium clerks, their whole futures tilting on their faces. A gene architect from some ring world, 2 brothers with a fusion lattice, a quiet delegation he didn't recognize, signing something thick. Arthuros was already among them, of course, a pale, tall figure bending his low voice to each in turn. Alejandro caught his eye and lifted a hand, warm with his own fortune and generous with it. Looks like you're making everyone's day, Lord Arthuros. Arthuros smiled, or the lower half of his face arranged itself toward a smile, while the wide eyes stayed exactly as they were. Innovation deserves to be rewarded, he said, wherever I find it. Alejandro rode that sentence all the way home. He called his brother from the transit lounge and made him read the contract figure twice, then a 3rd time to hear him swear. He bought nothing he needed and several things he didn't. Somewhere over the following months, the money stopped being a shock and became a fact, and he let himself, cautiously, be happy. The specific, careful happiness of a man who had spent his life, certain his best work would go unseen, and had been proven wrong in a single afternoon. Time passed. Almost a year later, the news came, and it came small. He was half listening to a briefing feed over breakfast. Colonial politics, a trade dispute, the usual noise of a frontier that argued with itself, when the anchor moved to a short item near the end. A civilization out along the far arm had gone quiet. No distress call, no declaration, no war. Communication simply stopped, and a survey ship sent to ask why it found the traffic dead and the orbital lanes empty. Analysts were calling it an infrastructure collapse. Investigations were ongoing. They put a name to the species and a still image behind the anchor's shoulder. A delegation in ceremonial dress, filed from some event. Alejandro's spoon stopped halfway. He knew them, not personally. He had seen them across an aisle at a fair, standing 3 tables down with something thick and official in front of them, and a tall, pale figure bending over their table in long robes, speaking too quietly to hear. "Weren't they right across from me?" He sat with the spoon in the air and the feed already moving on to weather. And for the first time since the day he sold the rain, the happiness in him held still and went cold at the edges. His brother laughed at him first. "Al, you sold them rain, not a bomb." Mateo's voice came warm and slightly tinny over the table display, half his face lit by some kitchen light 2 systems away. A world went quiet. Worlds go quiet. Bad harvest. Bad government. A reactor nobody maintained. It doesn't mean the nice man who made you rich is a murderer. I didn't say murderer. You didn't have to. Mateo softened. You've been waiting all this time for the catch. There's no catch. You made something good, and it made you money. And that's allowed to just be true. His sister said the same, more briskly. His wife said it more kindly, at night, with her hand flat on his chest. Jennifer had always been practical and unfailingly fair. If she thought he wasn't carrying someone else's guilt, he trusted her enough to believe it too. The species that had gone silent got a name, and a week of coverage in the news. And then the frontier went back to arguing about tariffs, and Alejandro let the water close over it. He was good at being happy that year. The second one he could not laugh off because he was watching the feed when it broke. A world along the middle arc. He knew the name before the anchor finished it. He had seen their delegation at the fair, robed in colors he'd thought were festival dress, and later learned were mourning. Communication lost. No wreckage, no fleet, no war declared. A survey team reported orbital lanes intact and silent, and the cities standing empty. Not burned. Empty. The spoon stopped halfway again, the way it had a year before, and this time it did not start moving. Empty! He turned the word over all night. A war leaves bodies. A plague leaves bodies. He lay awake and could not make the arithmetic come out to anything that left a city standing and took only the people. And toward morning, he stopped trying, because the only answer that fit was one he had no right to think. By the third world, coincidence was no longer an explanation. He went to the public archive of the exposition, the official record of exhibitors, delegations, and sales still there. He laid the 3 silent worlds against it. All 3 had been there. All 3 had signed with the consortium. And when he closed his eyes, he could see it. The thing he'd stood 10 feet from and called good luck. Lord Arthuros, moving down the aisle in his pale robes, unhurried, table to table. That low voice bending to a gene architect, to 2 brothers with a fusion lattice, to a delegation in mourning colors. He couldn't shake the feeling, though he had no proof of it, and nothing he could have said aloud without sounding mad. Lord Arthuros had asked about the people, not the inventions, the people. How many worlds? How governed? At the time, it had felt like flattery. Now, with those same worlds going silent one after another, the memory of that low voice asking after his colonies sat wrong in him and would not settle. And the species doing the invading, when the analysts finally named one, was not Arthuros's. Nobody at the fair had ever seen them. That was almost worse, because who would ever connect a beloved investor who bought inventions to a fleet no one could name? The Lord had never fired a shot. He had only asked questions, and smiled, and paid well. It was nothing. It was probably nothing. Alejandro told himself it was probably nothing for a long time. Then, by the 4th year, he was trying to make other people see it, and learning how a sane man gets called mad. He wrote to colonial administrators. He requested audiences with fleet liaisons. He built the registry into a clean, damning file. Worlds, dates, signatures, the single tall figure connecting all of them, and he sent it to anyone with rank enough to matter. The replies when they came were polite. The consortium was among the most respected institutions in charted space. The invasions were a tragedy under active investigation. Was Dr. Buenavista certain he wasn't connecting events that only appeared related? The house grew quieter around the subject. Mateo stopped arguing and started worrying, which was worse. His wife asked him once, gently, whether the file was helping him or pulling him under. He didn't have a good answer. He felt like a man who smelled smoke long before anyone else could. The fire was still too far away for anyone to see, and from where they stood, he was just the man insisting there was one. He had the file in his hands, ready to burn it, when the message came. It came without ceremony, a routing code, a clearance he hadn't requested, and an instruction to present himself at a naval station in high orbit, sender withheld. He almost deleted it as a prank. Then he saw the authority behind the clearance and understood that somewhere in the machine he had been shouting at, one door had opened. The station was cold, in the way military places are cold. No color spent where function would do. A rating walked him through gray corridors to a briefing room with a long table and a view of the planet turning below, and left him there. He waited 11 minutes. He counted them. Admiral Sebastian Poole came in alone, carrying nothing, and Alejandro understood in the first 3 seconds that this was a different kind of man than the ones who'd sent him polite refusals. 50, give or take, built solid and self-assured, with a face that had been left out in a lot of weather and a pair of eyes that went over Alejandro once. Clothes, hands, posture, the file case under his arm, and finished the inventory before he'd sat down. He did not offer his hand. He sat, set his own reader on the table, and looked at Alejandro, the way a man looks at the last piece he's been missing and isn't yet sure he wants. Dr. Buenavista. Not a question. You've been a nuisance to a lot of my colleagues. I've been trying to be. I know. I read all of it. Poole folded his hands. 16 months ago, I flagged a problem and got told, more or less, what you've been getting told. So I've been working it quietly, with sources you don't have. You found 3 worlds from public feeds. I found 9. Different regions, different governments, no common enemy anyone can name. All of them hit clean. No siege, no bombardment, no demands. The fleets that took them knew the defenses before they arrived, knew the jump routes, knew where the fault lines in the government were, and pushed on exactly those. He tilted his head a fraction. You do not plan an operation like that from outside. You plan it from a briefing. Somebody handed them a briefing on each of those worlds, complete, months ahead. I could see the briefing existed. I could not find who wrote it. Alejandro set his own file on the table and turned it toward him. I can tell you who wrote it, he said. I watched him take the notes. Poole did not reach for it right away. He watched Alejandro's face for the length of a breath, weighing whether he was about to be sold something. Then he opened the file and read. And the room went quiet, except for the small sounds of a man turning pages faster than he was reading them. The consortium, Poole said at last. Flat. The front man, Lord Arthuros. He buys inventions at the fair. Legitimately, everyone sees it. It's the least secret thing he does. But he doesn't ask about the inventions. He asks about the inventors. Where they're from, how many worlds, how they're governed, what they're afraid of. Alejandro tapped the registry. Every world on my list was at that fair. Every one of them signed with him. I stood 10 feet away and watched him talk to them all, and I thought he was just being charming. His people aren't the ones invading. No, that's why it works. Nobody looks twice at the man who's making them richer. Poole sat back. For a while he said nothing, and Alejandro had the sense of a very large, very methodical machine, turning over behind the weathered face, testing the shape against everything it already held, and finding, joint by joint, that it fit. Empty, Poole said finally, to himself almost. That's the part that never sat right. That's the part that doesn't fit anything. He frowned at it. You take a world for its ground. You burn off who's on it and move in. And you leave bodies. You take a world to break it. There's wreckage, a fleet, a flag. But these, he shook his head slowly. No bodies, no wreckage, no one moving in. The people are just gone, and the city's left standing. And I've read that report 9 times, and I still can't tell you what kind of enemy empties a world and takes nothing you can see. He looked up. I don't know what they're doing with them, Doctor. I only know it doesn't look like any conquest I've ever seen. The sentence landed in Alejandro's chest and stayed there. He had carried the shape of it for years, without ever letting himself say the last part out loud. How many more did your people find? Poole didn't need the file. He'd clearly done this arithmetic before Alejandro ever walked in, and had been waiting to see if the civilian would arrive at the same edge on his own. A handful, he said. The pattern runs steady, consistent. He turned the reader so Alejandro could see the list. Every remaining world on it had one thing in common: imported weather systems, licensed through Buena Vista Environmental. One name, though, hit harder than the rest. Newest edition, Poole said. Frontier colony, dry world, growing fast, loosely defended, and settled in the last few years with imported weather tech. His eyes came up, level and cold. Rain, Doctor. That colony runs on your rain. Alejandro read the name of the world and felt the floor of the last few years fall out from under him. He knew that world. He had helped make it livable. His brother had gone out there to build a life on ground that only held water because of the thing Alejandro invented. When? He asked. His voice didn't sound like his own. If the pattern holds, and it has held 9 times. Poole closed the reader. About a year. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Below the window the planet turned, amber beneath bands of white cloud, full of people who thought tomorrow was a certainty. Nobody believed me for 4 years, Alejandro said. What made you decide I was worth calling? Because your file stopped being the only one, Poole said. My people kept finding the same worlds you did. Then they found more, different sources, same pattern. By the time your report reached my desk, I wasn't deciding whether to believe you. I was deciding whether you knew something I didn't. He paused at the door. If we're right, we have something none of the others ever did. Time. Let's not waste it. Poole gave him a laboratory, a security clearance, and one question. If you wanted to turn your rain into a weapon, the Admiral said, standing in the doorway of the workspace he'd had cleared out in a lower ring of the station, how would you do it? I've thought about it, he admitted. Since the second world, I made myself stop. Start again. Poole didn't soften it. Whatever you can work out, their engineers already have. They've had your device for years and a reason to take it apart. I need to know what's coming at us before it comes, and the only man alive who can tell me built the thing. So build me the weapon, Doctor, on paper, so we know its face when we see it. So Alejandro sat down and, for the first time, turned his mind fully against his own creation. It was easier than it should have been, and that frightened him. The device didn't make water. It moved it, pulled moisture from ground and rock and air, concentrated it, and released it where you wanted. Every function that gave a dry world rain had a mirror. Pull the moisture and refuse to release it, and you didn't water a planet. You wrung it out. Hold it, build it, dump it all at once, and you drowned a valley instead of feeding it. The same hands that could end a drought could make one, could make a flood, could take a colony that trusted its weather to a machine and turn its own sky against it, slowly, so the people starved or drowned or fled before a single ship arrived. He worked it through in cold detail and wrote it all down. And some nights, he sat with what he'd written and felt sick, because the engineering was good, even if what it engineered was murder. This is what they'll do, he told Poole, laying it out. They won't bombard. They'll deploy a weaponized unit in orbit or on the ground and break the world's weather first, starve it, flood it, panic it. By the time anyone understands they're under attack, they've already lost, because you can't fight the rain. Poole studied the schematics a long time. Can you stop it? That's the part that matters. Alejandro pulled up the counter design he'd been building alongside the weapon, because once you know exactly how a thing is broken, you know where to put your hands to hold it together. I built the original. I know its architecture better than anyone who's only ever modified it. If they deploy a weaponized unit, it's still my device underneath their changes. Same core, same control frequencies, same assumptions. Get me close enough, give me a link to it, and I can fight it, jam it, turn it back. It won't be clean, and it won't be instant. But their weapon has my fingerprints all over the inside, and I know where the seams are. He looked up. They've never used it on someone who could argue with it. Every world they hit, the inventor was already gone. I'm not gone. For the first time, something moved in Poole's weathered face that might have been satisfaction. Then that's our fight, he said. You take the weapon. I take the fleet. The fleet was the harder problem, and Poole spent the year on it the way Alejandro spent his on the device. He couldn't defend a colony because he didn't know which colony. Humanity was next on the list. That much the pattern screamed. But the list had a shape, not a name. Frontier worlds, dry, growing fast, dependent on imported weather tech, thin on defenses. Half a dozen fit. Poole couldn't fortify all of them without tipping his hand, and tipping his hand was the one thing that would cost him the only advantage he had. They win by surprise, he told Alejandro, during one of the late sessions where the two of them had started thinking out loud together. 9 worlds, and not one of them saw it coming until their own infrastructure turned against them. The whole method depends on the target being asleep. The moment they learn we're awake, they change the target, or the timing, or the approach, and we're back to blind. He set a marker on each candidate world in turn, so we can't wake anyone up. We watch. We keep a strike group, hot and hidden, and we wait for them to show us the world by hitting it. Then we move faster than anyone's ever moved to a world under attack. You're going to let it start, Alejandro said. I'm going to let it start. Poole didn't look away from it. Because if I move first, I lose. And if I lose, it isn't one colony. It's all of them. 1 a year. Forever. I don't have the proof to evacuate a single world, Doctor. I've got a theory, and a civilian inventor the fleet already thinks is chasing ghosts. Nobody's clearing a frontier colony on that. His voice stayed level, which was worse than if it had risen. People will die in the opening. That's the cost of not losing everything. I've made the arithmetic. I don't expect you to like it. Alejandro pushed anyway. Pushed to warn the candidate worlds quietly, to get someone to listen the way he'd spent 4 years failing to get someone to listen. And Poole, patiently, coldly, walked him through why every version of it lost. A warning that leaked, a colony that panicked, an enemy that simply picked a different world while humanity braced the wrong one. You spent 4 years learning nobody would believe you, Poole said. That hasn't changed. The only thing that's changed is that now one man does, and that man commands a strike group. Don't waste it trying to save everyone. We save who we can save the only way the math lets us. He held Alejandro's eyes. Your job is the weapon. Mine is the timing. Leave the timing to me. So Alejandro built his counter, and Poole drilled his fleet, and neither of them said aloud the thing they both knew. That somewhere on one of those 6 worlds, people were going to sleep every night, with no idea their names were already on a list, and that the 2 men who knew were going to watch and wait and let the first blow land, because it was the only way to answer the ones that came after. The Marines trained for a boarding nobody could yet describe. Poole built them a profile from 9 invasions, how these fleets deployed, how they screened their command ships, what the intelligence said about the tall-robed brokers, who sometimes rode with them to appraise the taken person. He didn't tell the Marines the whole of it. He told them enough. They trained to hit a command vessel, take it fast, and bring something off it alive. By the end of the year, the strike group sat hidden and hot behind a dead moon, drives warm, crews sleeping in shifts. Alejandro's counter unit was built, tested against his own weaponized design, until he could break his own creation in a controlled room in under a minute. 6 worlds went on with their lives, ordinary and unaware. And then, on an ordinary day, one of them stopped being ordinary. The alert reached the station as a priority burst. A frontier colony reporting catastrophic weather failure. Systems it didn't recognize seizing control of its climate grid. Drought conditions spreading across its agricultural belt in hours instead of seasons. No fleet sighted, no demands. Just a sky that had stopped obeying, exactly the way Alejandro had written it would. Poole was moving before the burst finished, barking the strike group awake, and Alejandro ran the corridor at his side with his counter unit already slung and his heart going hard, because after a year of waiting, the enemy had finally made its choice. Then the name of the colony came up on the display, and Alejandro stopped running. He knew that name. He had helped make that ground hold water. His brother had gone out there to build a life on it. That's Mateo's colony, he said, and his voice came out of him from very far away. Admiral, that's my brother's world. Poole looked at the name and at Alejandro, and for 1 second, the hardness cracked, and something almost like grief showed through it, because he had spent a year making arithmetic, and the arithmetic had just picked the cruelest possible answer. And there was still only one thing to do. Then we get there fast, Poole said. Move! The colony was called Serrano's Reach, and its morning began like every other. The agricultural belt ran green and improbable across a valley that had been dead rock a decade before, watered by a grid the settlers no longer thought about, the way you don't think about your own heartbeat. In the low districts along the river, the early markets opened. Children went to school. On the coast, the fishing boats went out on a flat, kind sea. 250,000 people spent the first hours of that day doing the ordinary, immortal things people do when they have no idea their world is already marked for death. The sky turned a little after midday, and at first it only looked like weather. The grid stuttered. The temperature slid. Out over the agricultural belt, the moisture began, impossibly, to leave, pulled up out of the soil and the air, and refused back, so that within an hour the green valley was breathing out its own water and getting nothing in return. The fields going pale, then gray, then to cracked ruin, faster than any drought had ever moved. The settlers stood in their farms and watched a decade of work die between breakfast and dusk, and did not understand, because there was nothing to understand. The sky had simply stopped obeying. On the coast, it did the opposite. Everything the machine tore from the valley it carried to the sea and let fall at once. The rain came down on the river districts not as weather, but as a dropped ocean, hours of it in minutes, and the river came up in the dark before anyone grasped that this was not a storm to be waited out. It took the low districts fast. It took them in the first hours, in the night. While the people there were still telling each other it would pass, the water rising through the markets and the schools and the river view houses, faster than warnings could travel, faster than anyone could climb. No enemy had been seen. No demand had been made. There was only a colony drowning on one shore and withering on the other, killed by its own sky, exactly as a man in a clean room 2 systems away had predicted. By the time the alert clawed its way to Poole Station, Serrano's Reach had been under the weapon for most of a day. They crossed to Serrano's Reach in 11 hours, and there was nothing Alejandro could do for any of them. His counter unit could not help until they arrived, and his brother was already under the sky he'd built. He sat in a corner of the command deck and did the arithmetic he'd sworn off. By the time they reached Serrano's Reach, the weapon would have been running for a day and 11 hours. Poole passed behind him once and said, "Stop counting," and Alejandro couldn't. They came out of their crossing above a world dying in slow motion. It was exactly what he'd written. The grid seized and inverted. The valley wrung to gray ruin. The coast drowned. Drought on one hemisphere and flood on the other, both from the same stolen device, both doing precisely what he'd promised. Poole a weaponized rain machine would do, because the engineers who'd built this had read the same physics he had, and he was about to prove he'd read it better. Command unit. High orbit. Right where you said. The harvest fleet isn't here yet. They're not even hiding it. Nobody's ever been able to touch it. Go. They put him on a hard line to the weapon, and Alejandro reached out and touched his own invention, and found it as familiar and as changed as he'd known it would be. They'd built layers of aggression over it, locks and lockouts. Good work, their engineers' work. But underneath, at the core where the water actually moved, it was his, with his assumptions and his frequencies, and the seams he'd spent a year learning to break. He stopped fighting for the whole machine and went for the one instruction under everything, the line that told the device whether to give water or take it, and wrenched it back toward the only thing he'd ever meant it to do. The sky over the valley broke open and rained. Real rain, on cracked gray fields. On the coast, the flooding machine choked and stalled as he pulled its stolen water back into balance. 40 minutes, and it left him soaked in his own sweat and shaking. And when it was done, the weapon was his. Inert. Neutralized. Giving instead of taking. "Weapons down," he reported, his voice gone to gravel. "The sky's ours." "Good work," Poole said. Alejandro had given Serrano's Reach its sky back. It had taken him a day and 11 hours and 40 minutes. It had been too long, but he had. An hour later, the casualty manifests reached orbit. The drought belt had held. Farms lost. Not lives. It was the coast that had drowned in the first hours, in the dark, before anyone knew it was an attack. The low districts had gone under fast. Mateo had lived in the low districts. The name came up on a manifest with 10,000 others, and Alejandro read it, and read it again, certain there had been an error. There was no error. His brother had drowned in the first hours, in the dark, in water called down by the machine Alejandro built, hours before Alejandro arrived to turn that machine off. He had saved 250,000 people on the drought hemisphere. He had not saved the one man who'd told him years ago, "Put the whole thing down. It isn't yours to carry." He made no sound. That was what Poole saw, the civilian standing very still in the hatch with a manifest open in his hand, and nothing on his face, the stillness of a man whose grief hasn't found the door yet. "Doctor, I'm sorry. My brother. The low districts. The flood took them before I got here, before I turned it off. The next words came apart in his hands. I turned it off an hour too late for the only... He didn't try it again. Poole didn't tell him it wasn't his fault. He didn't offer the true and useless things, that he'd saved the others, that he couldn't have known, that the odds had been 1 in 6. He'd stood on this fleet a year ago and said the arithmetic out loud in front of this man. People will die in the opening. That's the cost of not losing everything. And now the arithmetic had a name, and it was the name of the one person who would have made this man whole. Some costs you don't get to apologize for. You carry them where the other man can see you carrying them. I know, Poole said. I know. Below them, the Harvester's fleet was closing, and the strike group was coming about, and the war Poole had spent a year building toward was about to begin in earnest. He gave Alejandro 1 moment. 1. I need you a while longer, Doctor, he said, quiet. The weapon's yours, and I need it kept down while I take their fleet apart. After that, you can put it down, all of it. But not yet. Give me 1 more hour. Somewhere behind Alejandro's eyes, the man who'd sold rain to the stars was learning what it had cost, and would go on learning it the rest of his life. But his hands were already moving back toward the link. You'll have your hour, he said. Outside, for the first time in 9 invasions, the fleet that harvested worlds met a fleet that had been waiting for it. The Harvester fleet died the way Poole had spent a year promising it would, and when it was over, he did not feel victory. He felt the arithmetic settling. They had come for the 10th easy world and found the first that was ready. Poole's strike group had come out from behind Serrano's second moon in the moment the enemy committed to the harvest, when their ships were spread and slow and confident, formed up for landing rather than for battle, and Poole had spent the advantage of surprise, the way a careful man spends money he'll only have once. Railguns opened the range before the enemy understood there was a range. His screen took their flank, while their command ships were still turning. It was not a fair fight, and Poole had never once in his life wanted a fair fight. Fair fights were for men who hadn't done their homework. But the enemy were not fools, and they did not die cheaply. By the time the last of their hulls came apart, Poole had lost ships and men of his own. He carried those losses. He always did. Below him, the colony's sky was Alejandro's again. The drowning stopped, the drought broken. 10,000 names already fixed on a manifest that no victory would unwrite. He had won, and a world had still been gutted, and a good man 2 decks down had lost the only brother he had. Poole did not go to Alejandro. There was nothing he could say that the man didn't already know, and Poole had learned long ago that grief wants presence, not speeches, and he had none of the first to spare yet. He had a prisoner instead. He went to the prisoner. They'd pulled him from a crippled command ship, an officer by the markings, senior enough to know things. Poole had him held in a bare compartment, and he went in alone, except for 2 of his people, and he did not raise his voice once the entire time. You take worlds and you keep the people, Poole said. Not the ground, the people. Why? The officer said nothing. Poole nodded, and one of his people hit him, once, professionally, and Poole asked again, in exactly the same tone, as if the blow had been punctuation. Why the people? It took a while. Poole had all the time in the universe. The officer was hard, but Poole had spent his career learning that every man has a breaking point. This man's ship was wreckage, his fleet was gone, and no rescue was coming. Somewhere during the 3rd time, Poole asked the same quiet question. He reached it. Labor, the officer said finally, through a split mouth. They fought a war, a long one, a great one, out past anywhere these frontier children had ever mapped. And wars of that size ate populations faster than any species could breed them. So they didn't grow their workers. They took them. whole civilizations, harvested and shipped and spent to feed a war that had been running longer than humanity had owned fire. And you pick the ones that make it easy, Poole said. The ones that depend on the machines they can't live without. How do you know which worlds have them? The officer's ruined mouth moved towards something that might have been contempt. They didn't have to know, he said. Someone told them. Someone sold them the worlds, appraised, cataloged, complete. Defenses, doctrine, jump routes, and the machines the world couldn't live without. All of it bought clean at the great fairs where the young species came to show off their toys and handed to the consortium, wrapped in a bow. They didn't hunt. They shopped. A buyer, Poole said. Give me the buyer. The officer didn't know the buyer's name. He'd never met him. He only knew there was always someone, a representative who moved through the great fairs, bought the inventions, asked about the people as much as the machines, and passed the worlds along already cataloged. Poole said nothing for a long moment. There were not many people in charted space who fit that description. One name came to mind immediately, and that was exactly why he refused to trust it. A suspicion wasn't proof. Poole stood in the bare compartment and let it lock into place, joint by joint, the way the whole picture had locked into place across a table on his station a year ago when a thin, desperate man slid a file toward him. Alejandro had been right about the pattern, right about the buyer, right that someone was cataloging civilizations before they disappeared. But a pattern wasn't a name, and Poole wasn't about to put one to it until the evidence did it for him. A beaten man's testimony wasn't proof. Poole needed more than a broken officer's word. He needed paper. So he started with the only witness that couldn't lie, the captured ship itself. He got the address from the ship, not the man's home, his business. Buried in the command ship's contact routing, in among 100 legitimate-looking commercial ties, was a node that traced back to a single institution, the Arthuros Family Intergalactic Museum, a cultural treasure, a monument to philanthropy, the finest private collection of the artifacts of vanished and fallen civilizations anywhere in the galaxy, endowed by the Arthuros line across generations, open to all peoples. Poole looked at it for a long time. A museum did not belong in a warship's contact routing. Culture did not thread itself through the logistics of a slaving fleet. He put his intelligence people on it, and they came back with a picture that was, on its surface, spotless. And spotless was the tell. The museum's funding was too clean, too deep, too circular. Money moved through it in volumes no admission ticket ever justified, every transaction beautifully legal, and none of it making sense unless the museum was not a museum at all, but a laundry, a respectable face over a set of books somebody very powerful needed to keep somewhere no one would ever think to look. Who raids a museum? Nobody. That was exactly why it worked, and exactly why Poole decided to. He didn't send a fleet. He sent ghosts. A museum had no orbital defenses, no fleet, no reason to expect an assault. It was the wrong problem for warships, and the right one for the Marines. Poole had spent a year preparing for work no one else knew they would ever do. They went in at the dead hour through a forgotten service approach. No breaching charges, no railguns, no noise. They had trained for boarding actions and firefights. Instead, they crossed polished museum floors without leaving a footprint. Their job was simple. Go where no one expected them, take the records, and disappear before anyone knew they had been there. They moved through the dark halls, past relics from 100 vanished worlds without slowing. 3 levels down, behind a door that had no business on a museum floor, they found the record's core exactly where Poole's analysts had predicted. A guard nearly walked into them. One Marine flattened into the shadows, while the sentry passed within a meter, never looking up, They lifted the core, retraced their route, and were gone before the shift changed. When the museum opened the next morning, the most damning object it had ever housed was already 3 jumps away in the belly of Poole's ship, and no alarm had ever sounded. They cracked the record's core in transit, and it was everything Poole had hoped to find. Not a museum's books, but the consortium's. Payment ledgers stretching back decades, every transaction laid out in immaculate accountancy. On one side stood the consortium, on the other, threaded through every page as broker, appraiser, and buyer, the Arthuros line. World after world had been cataloged, priced, and sold. Each entry recorded its defenses, its doctrine, its dependence on the machines its people had proudly unveiled at some bright fair, and the date the world had gone silent. Poole already knew 9 of the names by heart. The 10th, on the most recent page, was Serrano's Reach. For the first time in the entire length of it, 6 years for Alejandro, 2 for Poole, 9 dead worlds for everyone. Humanity held proof. The ledger also revealed who it belonged to. Threaded through the accounts, among the routing codes, endowments, and immaculate charitable finances, one destination appeared again and again as the recipient of the profits: the Arthuros family seat. The old fortified heart of the line, where the angel investor of the galaxy returned between fares, secure in the certainty that no one would ever connect the patron of hope to the emptied worlds, because no one ever had. Poole sat with the address on the screen in front of him and the proof beside it, and for a moment he did not move at all. Then he keyed his command channel, and his voice, when it came, was very quiet and very steady. The voice of a man who had finished doing his homework. "Get me the strike group," he said. "All of it. I have a name, and I have the paper, and I have a house to go to." Alejandro found Poole in the hangar, watching the Marines load, and asked him for one thing. "Take him alive." Poole didn't turn from the dropships. "That's the plan. I need what's in his head as much as what's in his ledgers. That's not why I'm asking." Alejandro's voice had the flat exhaustion of a man who hadn't slept since a manifest. "If you kill him, it's over, and it's clean, and he gets to be a dead lord, murdered in his home by animals. That's the story the galaxy keeps." He made himself say the rest. Mateo would have wanted him to answer, not to die, to answer. My brother was the reasonable one. Let me give him that, since I couldn't give him anything else. Poole looked at him then, the thin, hollowed man who'd been right for 6 years and had lost the only thing being right was supposed to protect. Whatever the Admiral saw, he nodded once. "Alive," he said. "You have my word. Stay up here, Doctor. This next part isn't yours." "I know." Alejandro didn't argue. He'd never wanted the gun. He wanted the answer. And the answer was a thing other men would have to go down and take. "Bring me his answer." Poole went down to take it. The House of Arthuros sat on a green world that had never known a hungry season, an old, groomed planet of gardens and long light, the ancestral seat of a line that had spent generations being beloved. From the outside, the castle at its heart looked less like a fortress than a monument, all pale stone, high windows, and terraces that had never expected a war. That was the first thing Poole's people learned, and the last thing the house guard learned too late. A home built to be admired is a hard thing to defend. They came in fast and low under the world's own weather, and the assault began the way Poole had drilled it 100 times in a welded corridor 2 systems away, except that this time the doors were real, and the men behind them died for real. The house guard were not ceremonial. That was the second thing Poole's people learned. Arthuros's family had kept an elite for generations, disciplined, well-armed, loyal past reason to the line that fed them. and they met the Marines in the pale halls with everything they had. The fight went room to room through a lord's beautiful home, breaching charge and rifle and the flat, brutal arithmetic of close quarters, marble cracking under fire. That marble was never meant to stop. Tapestries burning, the long light through the high windows going gray with smoke. The guard held the grand stair and made the Marines pay for every step of it. Men Poole had trained in the dark on his lower ring died on a nobleman's carpet a long way from home, and the Marines didn't stop, because behind those walls lived the man who had sold 9 civilizations to their deaths. They broke the stair. They broke the guard at the top of it. They pushed through the burning splendor of a house that had marked 100 civilizations for death and had never once imagined the bill arriving at its own door, and they cornered the master of it in a high, bright room full of windows, with his last guards dead around him and the smoke of his own halls coming under the doors. Lord Arthuros stood among the wreckage of his home in his long, pale robes, and he was not afraid. That was the thing that would stay with the Marines who were there, not defiance. Defiance they'd have understood. Serenity. The tall figure turned to the armored men who'd fought through his house to reach him, the wide, unblinking eyes moving over their weapons and their dead, and the low voice, when it came, had never risen and did not rise now. "You've made a terrible mistake," Arthuros said. He said it gently, the way a man corrects a child who has broken something valuable through ignorance. "I don't know what you believe you've found. I am a patron of the arts. I fund innovation. I have spent my life rewarding the best of what young species make, and I have never in that life raised a hand against anyone." His gaze found Poole through the visor, unerring, calm. "You've killed my household. You've burned my family's home. And you will not be able to tell anyone why, because there is no why. There is only a grief-stricken people who needed a monster, and chose one who could not fight back." "Take him," Poole said. They took him. He did not resist, and that was worse than resistance, because a man who does not resist is a man who is certain he will walk out. His robes were not even disarranged as they bound his hands. The Concorde ships arrived before the smoke had cleared. They came fast and official and unannounced, a delegation of the Galactic Concord dropping into orbit over the burning house, with the full weight of galactic law behind them, and Poole understood the moment he saw them that they had not come for the truth. They had come for Arthuros. The most respected institution in charted space had learned that a human fleet was assaulting the home of the galaxy's most beloved philanthropist, and it had come with all speed to stop the barbarians before they finished the job. The Concord officials swept into the ruined bright room with their credentials raised like shields, and they did not look at the ledgers Poole's people had pulled from a museum, and they did not look at the dead house guard or ask what an art patron needed an elite household army for. They looked at Lord Arthuros, bound and serene amid the wreckage of his home, and they saw exactly what he had spent a lifetime building them to see. A wronged nobleman in the hands of a violent young species that had lost a colony and gone mad with grief. "This being is under the protection of the Concorde," their lead said, and it was not a request. "He will be released to our custody and escorted to a secure facility pending inquiry. Any charges will be brought before the proper body, through the proper channels, under the proper law." The eyes that turned on Poole were not unkind, and that was the worst of it. They were the eyes of decent people who had been told a decent lie by someone whose word was worth more than a human admiral's would ever be. "You will stand down, Admiral. You have done enough harm here for one day." Poole had proof in his ship. He had a ledger with Serrano's Reach priced and dated and sold. He had the paper, and he watched it become worthless in real time, because the paper was human paper about a conquered lord, and the conquered had already decided whose story was true. They would not kill him. They would not even try him. Not really. Not a being whose money and blood ran through the conquered's own halls. They would escort him to a comfortable cell, and there would be an inquiry, and the inquiry would take years, and at the end of it, the angel investor of the galaxy would walk back out into the light with his name intact and his grief performed and 100 more fares ahead of him. Poole knew all of it, standing in the smoke, and he did not raise his voice, because raising his voice had never once in his life gotten him anything worth having. They brought Arthuros past him on the way out, the Lord, bound but unbroken, escorted now not as a prisoner, but as a rescued man, his serenity already settling into the shape of the story he would tell. For one moment the two of them stood level, the weathered admiral and the pale, untouchable lord, and Arthuros paused and inclined his head with perfect courtesy, as one does to a worthy adversary one will not have to think about again. Poole held his eyes. "They'll let you go," Poole said. Quiet. Certain. Not an accusation. A fact, laid down flat between them, the way one professional acknowledges the standing of another. Today, maybe for years, your money's in their walls and your blood's in their court, and I know it. And knowing it changes nothing. Today. Something moved at the corner of the Lord's wide eyes. Not fear. Amusement, almost, that the soldier understood the board so clearly and had lost anyway. "Then we understand each other, Admiral," Arthuros murmured. "How refreshing." "We do." Poole didn't look away. "So understand this. I have your ledger. I have your worlds, everyone, priced in your own hand. And I'm not a colony you can starve, or a fair you can charm, or a young species that doesn't know yet how the galaxy really works. I know now, and I have nothing left to do with the rest of my life, but bring what I know to the one room where even you have to stand and answer for it." He let it sit a moment in the smoke, in the ruin of the house that had marked Mateo's world for death. "I'll see you at the Conquered Tribunal," Poole said. "However many years it takes. I'll be the one still standing there when your story finally runs out." And he watched as they escorted the angel investor of the galaxy out of his burning house and up into the light, alive and untouched and already beyond Poole's reach, for now.
Hey there, space human. I'm really curious about your thoughts on this video. Drop a quick comment and let me know what's on your mind. Or just say hi if you prefer. Either way, I'd love to hear from you. Also, remember to check the pinned comment. Trust me, it's worth a look. Oh, and one last thing. I've chosen another video for you to watch. Just click the card here, or here if you want the whole playlist. See you there.